They called it the daylight gamble. In 1943, Allied bombers lifted from English runways and vanished into a grey sky. Each mission promised precision, each return cut short by loss. The idea was simple: strike Germany's war industries by day, when bombs could see their mark. But the air war was not kind to optimism. Over Europe, B-17s and B-24s droned toward the Reich. Their tight formations shimmered like moving silver islands in a hostile sea. They had guns everywhere, 13 per flying fortress. Crews believed that firepower alone could protect them. It was a comforting illusion. Once beyond fighter range, the escorts turned home. The bombers pressed on alone. Then came the swarming dots on the horizon. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving from the sun, radio chatter dissolved into chaos. Metal, smoke, and prayer filled the air. By the time survivors reached the channel, the formation was bleeding. Entire crews were missing. Squadrons erased in a single mission. And yet, headquarters insisted the plan was working. The math disagreed. Loss rates climbed past 20%. At that pace, no bomber group could last a month. Still, the generals clung to doctrine. Bombers will always get through. It was more faith than fact. In the debriefing tents, pilots spoke quietly. The men did not fear death as much as futility. They saw comrades vanish flame by flame. They watched empty bunks multiply. Each raid brought more questions than targets hit. Why risk everything if they could not reach deep Germany and return alive? Where was the escort that could go the distance? Engineers answered with hesitation. Range required fuel. Fuel meant weight. Weight stole speed and climb, a paradox born of physics and politics. Commanders distrusted long-range escorts. They feared fighters would abandon bombers to chase kills. They believed the cure would destroy discipline. So the idea was shelved. For now, bombers would stand alone, and the Luftwaffe would feast. Across the channel, in cold hangars, another story was forming. A sleek airframe with a laminar wing, a body designed in America but refined by British demand. They called it the P-51 Mustang. At first, no one expected greatness. It entered war as a low-altitude fighter, fast, but ordinary. Then a British engineer suggested a radical transplant, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the Mustang leapt to life. High-altitude speed, long legs, grace in climb and dive alike. Test pilots returned with quiet disbelief. Here was the escort they had been told could not exist. By late 1943, production lines awakened. Metal met purpose. Each new fuselage a promise to the men still flying unprotected. The 8th Air Force waited. They had heard rumors of a fighter that could reach Berlin and back. Few dared believe it. Rumor had disappointed before. The P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, both valiant, both short on range. But the Mustang's maps told another story. From East Anglia to Berlin and home again, with fuel to spare. It sounded like fantasy. And yet, blueprints did not lie. Inside strategy rooms, skepticism ruled. Some officers laughed it off. Long-range escort, impossible, fantasy on paper. But younger tacticians whispered otherwise. If the Mustang worked, the entire air war would change. It was not just about survival. It was about ending the debate that crippled Allied air power. The belief that bombers must die alone. The Luftwaffe had ruled daylight skies for 4 years. Their confidence was absolute. That confidence was about to meet a silhouette it had never seen before. In the frostbitten dawn of December 1943, a small group of pilots prepared for something new. Their aircraft gleamed beneath floodlights. Long-nosed, lean, unmistakable. A test flight, but also a promise. Engines roared, exhausts painting orange ghosts across the mist. The air smelled of oil, courage, and quiet defiance. As wheels left the runway, history tilted slightly forward. The Mustang climbed into the pale morning, cutting through cloud and doubt alike. Below, men watched until it vanished, unsure if they had just seen an experiment or salvation. The winter skies over Europe were cold and cruel. Clouds drifted like heavy curtains hiding the truth. The bombers were still dying. Every mission deep into Germany became a gamble with fate. The Luftwaffe's claws reached farther than Allied command wanted to admit. Crews climbed into their fortresses at dawn, breath visible in the freezing air. They joked about breakfast they would never eat. They carried letters they might never send. Above 20,000 feet, contrails marked their presence like scars across the sky. German radar watched, waiting. Fighter groups scrambled to intercept. In minutes, the horizon would fill with dark specks. A deadly choreography perfected over 4 years of air war. The first wave hit hard. Messerschmitts cutting across formation lines. Cannon fire streaking like lightning. The bombers answered with lead, their guns rattling in every direction. But every bullet cost time, and time was altitude. Engines flamed out. Wings folded. Men vanished into the cold air. Some parachutes opened, others didn't. In the command rooms of England, maps filled with black pins marking losses. Commanders read numbers but avoided the names. The debate grew louder. Could the war be won from the air if the air itself was owned by the enemy? The answer, whispered between engineers and young strategists, was waiting on the tarmac. The P-51 Mustang. It had proven its potential in test flights. But potential did not win wars. Production did. Factories raced against time. Every rivet, every wing panel was a question of survival. Pilots lined up for conversion training. Many had flown Thunderbolts, powerful but short-legged. Now they met a new aircraft that felt alive beneath their hands. Slim, responsive, unforgiving to the careless. It turned with elegance, climbed like hope, and dove like vengeance. The first squadrons formed quietly. The 354th Fighter Group, then the 357th. Names that would later echo through history, the Luftwaffe noticed. They called it the long-nosed Yankee. At first, they underestimated it. But the Mustangs began appearing farther and farther east. By January 1944, they were over Germany itself, escorting bombers all the way to the target and back. Suddenly, the balance began to tremble. German aces who once hunted at leisure now faced fighters on equal terms. Fuel was scarce, replacements fewer. Each dogfight became a test of nerve and dwindling experience. The Americans had finally found their reach. Back at the airfields, the tone shifted. Where once the crews watched bombers vanish in silence, now they watched Mustangs climb beside them. A silver guard against the rising sun. The pilots exchanged nods through cockpit glass. No words were needed. They knew this was the beginning of something different. Radio chatter told the rest. Little friends joining at altitude. Relief replaced resignation. Over the next weeks, bomber losses dropped by half. Morale soared higher than the contrails themselves. For the first time, hope became measurable. It had a name and wings. Even so, the cost remained. The Luftwaffe fought with desperation. Their pilots, some boys barely out of school, threw themselves into the sky. Every victory carried the shadow of sacrifice. Every mission took another friend away. But the tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. For the first time in years, the air war no longer belonged entirely to the enemy. From the command tents to the icy runways, the phrase whispered among crews was simple and reverent. The Mustangs are here. January 1944. The skies above Europe had changed, slightly, yet unmistakably. Now, silver shapes with long noses escorted the bomber streams. Pilots called them little friends. To the men inside the fortresses, they were guardian angels made of metal and willpower. The P-51 Mustang was no myth anymore. It was here, and it had something to prove. The first deep-range mission reached the heart of Germany. Berlin was still a rumor on the horizon, but Brunswick, Münster, and Oschersleben would become proving grounds. Fighter groups formed up at dawn, fuel tanks slung under their wings like lifelines. Each pilot carried more than ammunition. They carried the doubts of an entire command. Would this plane truly survive that far? Would it still fight when fuel ran low? They were about to find out. Halfway to the target, flak began its black ballet. Shells burst around the bomber boxes, each explosion carving new holes in the sky. The Mustangs climbed higher, cutting wide arcs above the formations, searching for the faint glint of enemy wings. Then, contact. German fighters rolled in from altitude, confident in tactics that had crushed bombers for years. But this time, something was different. Before they could dive, a line of silver streaks slashed across their path. Mustangs, fast-balanced, merciless dogfights erupted like storms. The radio cracked with calm American voices. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Engaging! Seconds later, German radio channels filled with confusion. Their hunters were now being hunted. The Mustangs moved with an agility unseen at that range. They could climb, roll, and dive without losing distance from the bombers. Even after hours aloft, their tanks still held enough to return home. For the first time, Allied fighters did not turn back early. They stayed until the bomb doors closed, and then stayed longer, guarding the retreat. To bomber crews, it felt like waking from a long nightmare. Through the plexiglass turrets, they watched their escorts swirl and strike. Hope had become visible, but victory demanded endurance. Engines overheated. Pilots flew 8-hour missions with frozen fingers and burning eyes. Some never returned. Flak tore wings apart. Mechanical failures forced landings in enemy fields. Yet morale refused to break. Each loss was answered by another sortie, another squadron pushing deeper. Each mile flown rewriting doctrine that once declared it impossible. At the debrief tables, veterans said little. They only nodded, the look in their eyes saying what reports could not. We made it there and back. The Germans responded with heavier opposition. Flak batteries multiplied. Fighter formations grew desperate. But desperation carries mistakes. The Luftwaffe, strained by fuel and fatigue, could not replace experience as fast as it was dying. Every engagement now cost them precious pilots, the kind that once ruled the skies. The Mustangs, lean and efficient, kept coming, day after day, turning attrition into strategy. This was no longer about testing a machine. It was about endurance, human, mechanical, and moral. On the ground, factory workers painted fresh squadron codes. Women riveting wings spoke in quiet pride. They knew what those letters meant. Each aircraft, another step toward ending the nightmare of daylight war. By spring, the P-51 had earned its reputation, not through propaganda, but through persistence. The long-range escort was no longer a theory. It was a fact that changed the mathematics of war. Spring 1944. Europe's skies began to sound different. The deep, rolling thunder of bomber formations no longer echoed alone. Above them, the high-pitched song of Mustangs now laced through the air, a harmony of protection. Calm, lethal, disciplined. The strategy that once bled men and machines was now rewriting itself in real time. For the first time, the Allies owned daylight. Every morning, long silver lines crossed the English countryside, thousands of aircraft rising in sequence, heading east. To the German radar operators, it was an endless storm. To the Allied air crews, it was routine, deadly but controlled. The 8th Air Force struck synthetic oil plants, rail junctions, and aircraft factories. Targets once considered untouchable now burned beneath precision daylight raids. Behind every bombing success was a Mustang somewhere overhead, turning, climbing, shielding, or chasing. They became a living network, stretching from the Channel to the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They shifted airfields, staggered squadrons, trained new recruits as fast as they buried veterans. But the odds no longer balanced. The Allies had fuel, production, and numbers. And now, reach. The Mustang was not just a weapon, it was a multiplier. By escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, it forced the Luftwaffe to fight everywhere at once. Each interception burned precious fuel. Each mission cost irreplaceable men. The once feared Jagdwaffe began to fracture under the weight of endless combat. In March 1944, Allied command took the next step, Operation Argument, later called the Big Week, a massive coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry. Every factory, assembly line, and testing site would be hit, simultaneously, relentlessly, and in daylight. The Luftwaffe rose to meet it. They had no choice. From Bremen to Augsburg, sky after sky filled with contrails and cannon flashes. For 5 brutal days, the air war reached its turning point. The Mustangs cut through the enemy like scalpels through armor. They chased fighters even as bombers released their payloads. They dove into flak clouds, rolled through tracer fire, and came out the other side still fighting. Bomber losses remained heavy, but Luftwaffe losses became catastrophic. Hundreds of German aircraft fell from the sky. Veteran aces, once legends of the Reich, were now outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. By the end of that week, the Luftwaffe's daylight defense was broken. They would fight on, but never again from a position of dominance. Back in England, the effect was tangible. Crews returned with fewer empty seats. Airfields buzzed with the strange quiet of success, a silence born not from mourning, but relief. The commanders saw it too. Charts showed curves bending the right way, loss rates falling, mission ranges expanding. The long-range escort, once mocked as fantasy, had become the foundation of Allied air supremacy. It was more than a military shift. It was psychological. For years, German cities had slept safely by day. Now sirens wailed under the sun. The myth of invincibility cracked open. Factories hid under camouflage nets. Train lines moved only at night. The Reich was losing control of its own sky, and the men who once doubted the Mustang were now designing strategies around it. By summer 1944, the air above Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The transformation was total, steady, methodical, undeniable. The Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had redrawn the boundaries of the air war itself. Each mission now began with confidence, not dread. The maps that once carried black loss pins were filling with marks of progress instead. Every deep strike into Germany cut closer to the heart of the Reich. Refineries, rail lines, communication hubs, all burned by day. The strategy that once seemed suicidal now worked with frightening precision. But triumph came at a cost, measured not only in machines. Pilots grew weary. 8-hour flights meant hours of silence, oxygen masks, and mental endurance. Some watched their friends vanish within seconds of contact. Others landed with bullet holes across the wings and fuel nearly gone. Victory was no longer glorious. It was exhausting. Yet, through that exhaustion, discipline hardened into something stronger than hope. It became certainty. The airmen no longer questioned the mission. They knew it mattered. In Berlin, reports turned grim. Fuel reserves were collapsing. Factories were silent. And the Luftwaffe's young replacements, barely trained, flew into combat with fewer and fewer hours in the air. The veterans were gone. The once feared names of German aces were now etched on memorial boards. For the first time, Allied bombers reached their targets without constant attack. Sometimes, entire raids went unchallenged. The daylight sky that once devoured courage had become a corridor of inevitability. Meanwhile, on the ground in England, the rhythm of life adapted to victory's pace. Airfields buzzed with repair crews, laughter and radio static. Mess halls filled again. Letters home spoke of turning points and one more push. The Mustang squadrons had become symbols of momentum itself. Pilots were no longer anonymous. They were heroes in a new kind of war, one fought with endurance and precision instead of spectacle. By June 1944, when Allied troops stormed Normandy, the air above them was nearly empty of resistance. The P-51s swept the beaches, destroying bridges, trains, and convoys before they could reach the front. The invasion succeeded partly because the Luftwaffe could not interfere. The sky was Allied territory, clear, controlled, and owned. The Mustang's shadow stretched across the channel, a quiet proof of how air power had matured. But among the pilots, celebration was subdued. They had seen too much sky turn red, too many empty chairs in the briefing room. They had flown through storms of flak and come home to find silence where laughter used to be. So they smiled, yes, but it was a tired smile. For them, the victory was not just strategic, it was personal. It meant that the sacrifice, the endless missions, the years of debate and disbelief had all led somewhere worth reaching. As summer deepened, the Mustangs kept flying. They escorted, patrolled, and strafed, clearing the path for the armies now rolling eastward. And in every sortie, the lesson of endurance remained. War had changed. It was no longer about daring raids or single acts of heroism. It was about systems, persistence, and willpower. And in that new world of total war, the P-51 Mustang stood as its perfect machine. Not glamorous, but relentless. Autumn, 1944. The air war that once defined the edge of fear now defined the shape of victory. The P-51 Mustang had flown farther, fought longer, and endured more than anyone believed possible. What began as an experiment ended as legend. The numbers told the story better than speeches ever could. Bomber losses fell to their lowest since the campaign began. German fighter strength collapsed by nearly half, and for the first time, Allied airmen returned home more often than not. The debate was over. The escort question, the argument that haunted every mission, was buried beneath the contrails of Mustangs. In briefing rooms across England, the tone had changed. There were still missions, still dangers, still names written on chalkboards. But there was also something new. Quiet confidence. Commanders no longer spoke of surviving the air war. They spoke of finishing it. The Mustang had become more than a tool of survival. It was the proof that courage, engineering, and endurance could bend the impossible. It carried not only pilots but the very idea of persistence. As the Allied front advanced eastward, the Mustangs followed. They strafed retreating convoys, escorted transports, and guarded the skies above the Rhine. When victory finally came, it arrived under their shadow. In April 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled, Mustangs circled above the ruins of Berlin, not in triumph, but in solemn witness. The war that began in arrogance and air superiority ended in silence and smoke. The airmen who had doubted the possibility of long-range escort now watched the impossible parked in neat rows across every airfield. Many, who flew them, never came home. They rest beneath foreign soil, their names engraved in stone and in memory, but their legacy lives in every aircraft that followed, each one carrying lessons born from the skies of 1944. The Mustang's design became the template for a new era. Long-range, agile, efficient. It was the bridge between propeller and jet, between survival and supremacy. For the men who lived through it, the memories were not of glory but of endurance. The endless hum of engines, the vibration through cold metal, the endless sky that asked everything and gave nothing back. And yet, they endured. They turned fear into focus, loss into lesson, and doubt into history. The Mustang was their companion, unforgiving, elegant, and loyal to the end. After the war, many of those aircraft were sold, scrapped, or forgotten, but some survived, restored by hands that never flew them. At airshows decades later, the sound of the Merlin engine still draws silence from the crowd, a deep, rolling growl that echoes across generations. It is not just nostalgia, it is remembrance, a reminder of what doubt can become when challenged with courage. Today, historians call it the machine that changed the air war. Pilots simply called it the best friend they ever had. In museums and hangars, its silver wings still catch the light, a timeless shape against the muted air of peace. Each rivet, each curve, a whisper of the men who once lifted it toward the horizon and never came back. The sky is quiet again, but listen closely, and somewhere beyond the clouds, you can almost hear it. The soft growl of a Merlin engine fading into history, carrying the echo of the moment when they finally proved the world wrong.